today, to continue that celebration, we have Jordan Stutt coming back to campus. Jordan graduated in 2011 with a double major in environmental studies and international relations. He also went on to pursue a master's degree from Duke University in environmental management. And he's actually quite an staunch advocate of clean energy and clean transportation. And this is very unusual, but he has actually dedicated all his career on that topic. Most people, I feel like, meander a bit more, but he has worked in different places, always with a sort of similar general topic. So after Tufts, he worked at the Acadia Center to work on decarbonization policies in the transportation and power sectors across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. After that, he actually went to corporate America. He joined 7-Eleven and was there working on their EV policies team. So he was responsible to help support their launch of a public network of EV chargers, which I think is really cool. And finally, he moved on to where he is today, CALSTART. He is the Senior Director of the Northeast region. CALSTART is actually a national organization that focuses on clean transportation technology. And in this role, he works with organizations and community members to lead innovative clean energy projects and to shape policy. So we're super excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming to campus.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? All right. Well, I'm so excited to be back on campus. Thanks so much to Sarah for inviting me to participate here, and to Sunette for the help with organizing the slides, bringing back a lot of nice memories to be back on campus here. I'm going to be focusing my talk on accelerating the transition to zero-emission transportation. And because I am an alumni of both the Environmental Studies program and the IR program, I'll share a little bit about my career path since Tufts, and then get into the talk. Here's what we'll cover. I'm going to lay a little bit of the context, the groundwork for what's happening in the transportation sector. And then I'll provide a few specific examples of work that we're doing at my organization to help advance innovative solutions. So at Tufts, I came here in 2007 with a passion for the environment and a commitment to do something in sustainability, but frankly was pretty clueless about what that would be. I had no concept of what the careers could be that I would pursue in that field. And over the course of those 4 years, it started to slowly crystallize. I'll say that by the time I graduated, I still didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. But through a bunch of the courses I was able to take, I started getting more and more information about where I wanted to direct my energy. So listed a few of them. Negotiation and conflict resolution was awesome. I learned so much more than I expected to from that class. And to this day, that is absolutely the class that I apply most in my work. Just figuring out how to apply those lessons about negotiation, understanding what the other people in the room are looking for, figuring out how you can work with them rather than against them to advance everybody's interests. Intro to GIS was really helpful for me to get a better sense of spatial analysis, considering the different communities and stakeholders, where they at, and zooming out to be able to see. Can you hear me okay now? Okay in the back? All right. Thanks enough. And then finally, environmental policy was really eye-opening to me, understanding all of these new policies that are coming into place that directly confront climate change, local air quality, pollution. I learned a lot about something that had just launched called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So it was really cool to me that this was this brand new program incorporating all these new ideas about how environmental regulation could work, how it could both reduce pollution from power plants and generate money that each state in the program could invest in all sorts of good clean energy projects. And I understand that Marty Suberg now teaches that class, which is really exciting for me to learn. I know him as Commissioner Suberg and had a chance for many years to work sometimes as a cheerleader for all the work he was doing, sometimes as a little bit of a thorn in his side to push for more action from state government. But under his lead, they did so much fantastic work on RGGI and other similar programs. But that really got me excited about what a career could look like in this field. And so after a little bit of searching, a little bit of landscaping work, a little bit of catering work, I finally landed a job that felt like the first start of my career at the Pace Energy and Climate Center at Pace Law School. I worked there for a few years and got a really good sense of all the various ways that policy and law that better? Got a great sense for all the ways that policy and law and economics can help shape the way that the power sector works. I was really focused on reducing pollution from power plants at that time. And as an entry-level staff member there, I was thrown from one task to the next, which was sometimes a little frustrating, but ultimately gave me a really great breadth of expertise. And I was able to take meetings that I felt like I had no business being in. It forced me to really learn the content much better. Moved over to a similar nonprofit here in the Boston area in 2014 and stayed there for about 8 years, working on a whole wide range of clean energy projects and policies, and gradually transitioned from power sector work to the transportation sector and found it really exciting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation. As Sarah mentioned, I did a master's program through the Duke Nicholas School of the Environment while I was at Acadia Center. Got to brush up on my environmental economics and then applied that at my next job at 7-Eleven, where I was really excited to work on the launch of the 7Charge EV charging network and get a taste for what it's like in corporate America to build this infrastructure and confront those internal corporate challenges. And then finally landed at my current job at CALSTART, where I was really excited to be able to marry my passion for reducing pollution, innovative solutions in the transportation space, and doing it all in the region that I call home. So we've got a lot of projects in Massachusetts and Maine and New York, where I'm from, and I love being able to see that impact in the places that I know. So now getting into the transportation discussion, just want to start by setting the table with the emissions challenge that we're confronting here. And I think this line chart tells a pretty good story about where we're at. As you can see in that yellow line, the electric sector was the largest source of climate change causing CO2 emissions in the country for many, many years until 2016, I believe, that flipped and the transportation sector became our largest source of CO2 emissions. Around 2008, there's a really precipitous decline in electric sector emissions due to just a great combination of factors from policy at the federal level, at the state level with things like RGGI, with the emergence of new technology and cost reductions in solar and wind, improved energy efficiency. And we're still on a pretty steady decline in the electric sector. We're not seeing any of that progress on this chart in the transportation sector, with the exception of the COVID blip there. And that is really challenging, but also motivating to me, thinking through how we can start to bend that curve down and see similar trajectory from transportation. And digging into the East Coast, this is where my work is focused. We can see that transportation is not only the largest source of CO2 in just about all of these states, it accounts for almost half of the CO2 emissions in most of these states. So for any of these states where advocates or policymakers are really committed to reducing their contributions to climate change, they need to figure out a serious plan for what they're going to do about transportation. And some are doing some really fantastic work there. There's a lot of peer-to-peer learning happening. So it's an exciting time to be in this space. One thing I meant to mention up top, if folks have questions as I'm going through this, questions or comments, please feel free to just raise your hand. We'll have plenty of time at the end, but don't want to pause and risk forgetting a question as you go. Digging into the transportation sector and where those emissions are coming from, you can see here that the majority of emissions, 57%, are coming from light-duty vehicles. Those are the cars and trucks that we drive as passengers. A smaller section, 23%, comes from medium and heavy-duty vehicles. It's probably hard to see all those vehicle types in there, but that includes everything from heavy-duty pickup trucks to small shuttle buses to tractor trailers. And I think it's a really interesting segment of the vehicle population, because although it only accounts for 23% of GHG emissions, there's a really high opportunity for impact. So those medium and heavy duty vehicles account for less than 10% of the vehicles that are on the road. But as we've seen, that they account for a disproportionately high share of CO2 emissions, GHG emissions. But where it gets really interesting is when you look at the NOx emissions and the particulate matter, PM 2.5. Both NOx and particulate matter are really harmful to local health. So while the GHG emissions impact climate change globally, those latter two are literally killing people in the communities that are closest to those sources of pollution. And so if we want to address those local health impacts, focusing on this smaller number of vehicles that are owned and operated by a smaller number of people and companies can be a really, really helpful way to maximize the impact of our efforts. And digging into that particulate matter pollution, we can see that the cost and health burdens of that pollution are not spread equally. I know that in a previous lecture here, we had a speaker from the Union of Concerned Scientists. They put together this figure, so I'm not sure how deeply they've already covered this. But transportation pollution is causing really inequitable impacts in Massachusetts and across the country. I think this figure tells a very compelling story about who's subject to most of those pollution impacts from a racial perspective. There are a lot of interesting ways to look at those pollution impacts across the state through a variety of environmental justice screens. And what we see is that the communities that are closest to highways, warehouses, ports, they're subject to the most burden. So when we think about where 93 and 90, the Mass Pike meet right near Chinatown, there is a tremendous amount of pollution from passenger vehicles. When we look at Chelsea near the food distribution center, there's a tremendous amount of trucks that are running and idling there, making the air quality pretty terrible. So it's important that we consider where those pollution sources are and who's facing the brunt of the burden when we think about solutions. There are a lot of solutions coming. So this is where things get more positive. This is what we call at CalSTART our beachhead theory of change for how we can support the deployment of zero emission vehicles across that medium and heavy duty segment. And so it really begins with deploying those vehicles first, where there's a really strong economic case. So transit buses and cargo vans, the vans that deliver all those Amazon packages, those are relatively inexpensive on the electric side to deploy. They have well-known routes. It's easier for the fleet operators to understand how to use them and save money using them. And as we start manufacturing more of those, the costs come down per unit that we're manufacturing. The workforce to maintain those vehicles grows. And as those factors grow, we can do more and more and start building more and more types of zero-emission vehicles. The costs will come down. And now we're already seeing zero-emission vehicles being deployed almost at cost parity with internal combustion engine vehicles, all the way through some of those regional heavy-duty trucks. So it's really exciting to see the progress happening there. We're also seeing tremendous investment in EV manufacturing across the country. And as I'm highlighting here, a lot of that is happening in the Southeast and in the Midwest. So while in California and the Northeast, there's a ton of electric vehicle progress happening largely as a result of policy, there's also a lot of development and manufacturing happening in these other areas that have already demonstrated to be very good fits for new manufacturing. And as we see more and more of those factories getting up and running, more people employed in this field, we'll see costs coming down and more awareness of the benefits of this industry. And that's going to be really helpful politically. And because of all that new manufacturing, we're seeing more and more vehicles hitting the market that have longer range, that can carry heavier payload, and across a wide range of vehicle types. So this bubble chart's a lot to take in, but the thing that I really like to see is that the size of the circles are growing, meaning there's heavier payload capacity, and the distance that these vehicles can travel is farther, meaning that they're useful for more and more applications. So with that, I'm going to transition to some of the work that CALSTART is doing in this space, recognizing that this is how we're approaching it, but there are so many other folks in the field, both nonprofits and industry, that are doing tremendous work outside of this framework to make progress here. But the way that we're conceptualizing it is around these 5 initiatives. So we're working on light duty vehicles, we're working on trucks and buses, fuels, so thinking about electricity, but also trying to understand where hydrogen fits in, and then innovative mobility, which is where all of our work lives, that's focused on mode shift, getting people out of their passenger vehicles and into e-bikes, onto public transit, into active mobility. That work is spread across 4 different activity types. This is where we have our technology development and demonstration work, our market acceleration work, which is really focused around incentives for vehicles and building out the market. We do a lot of public policy work, and then we work with our 200 plus member companies in the transportation space to help them navigate this transition, to understand what challenges they're facing, and see how we can help them overcome those obstacles. And then I'm really proud to lead our Northeast Regional Office, where we pull all of that work from the initiatives, from the activities, and we bring it to life in the form of projects here in Massachusetts, in New England, and up and down the East Coast. I'm going to share a few examples of how that work looks, so what the projects look like, and then we can get into the Q&A from there. This is a little bit of an overwhelming figure, but it gives you a good sense of the variety of projects that we're working on in this region across transit and school buses, innovative mobility, electric trucks, light duty vehicles, and EV charging. And as you could see, we're engaged in projects all across the region. There's so much happening. There's so much defense to be played to support the policies that are in place to accelerate the market, but there's also a lot of proactive work happening where we're deploying new vehicles. Oops. So working from the smaller vehicles on up, I'll start by highlighting a project called E-Bikes for Environmental Justice. This is a project funded by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. I'm going to reference them a lot because they're doing a lot of tremendous work here. But through this project, CalSTART and the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission have partnered up to deploy e-bikes to low and moderate income individuals in the Pioneer Valley. It's a particularly rural part of Western Mass where there just aren't that many great mobility options if you don't have your own vehicle. So what we're looking to do here is demonstrate the viability of an incentive program for e-bikes, increase access to them, and give more people out there more ways to get around, and then really carefully study how these e-bikes are being used, understanding the car trips that they can displace, the amount of pollution that they're displacing, the exercise that people are getting from riding them. And we want to do all that so that we can make this a scalable project. Everything that we're doing starts small. We test out the theories, we test out the technology, and then use all of that information to help build these programs for large scale impact. I'm very excited that because of the early findings that we've got from this program and other similar pilot projects across the state, Massachusetts is now going to be standing up a statewide program along these lines to get more e-bikes out there and really to focus on the equitable deployment of them. A little bit bigger, looking at passenger vehicles, we are working on a program called Charge at Work. This is a program that we're running for the US Department of Energy, where we are doing everything that we can to help employers install charging at work so that employees know that they'll have a reliable place to charge their EV. That charging is typically really cheap from a grid perspective. It's cheap from a driver perspective. It's a great way for employers to recruit and maintain staff. And for a lot of folks who don't have a driveway where they know they can park their EV and plug it into their house, having other options for reliable charging is a necessity if they want to get an EV. So really excited about the way this program is going. I saw that Tufts already has a couple EV chargers in one of the parking lots, I think the covered lot. Would love to see more of those, but it's a good start. But this is exactly the kind of thing that we want to see more of. We want to see those more visible so that people know it's an option and feel a little bit more comfortable making that switch to EVs. Another Massachusetts project to highlight, thanks to the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, is the Massachusetts Fleet Advisor Program. Through this project, our Northeast team basically functions as a free consultant to fleets all across the state that are thinking about replacing some of their trucks and vans and buses with electric alternatives. So what we do is look at all the vehicles in a fleet. We look at where they stay overnight, how long they stay at that location. We evaluate, could they charge at that location? We look at where they're driving and understand the range that they're going to need to cover, and then make recommendations about which of those vehicles are well suited for electric alternatives. And this is where some of the economics come in. We put together total cost of ownership figures for them to help them understand when the investment in an electric alternative would reach cost parity with the gas or diesel alternative. So in this real world example that I'm highlighting, these are pickup trucks that are currently part of the Tufts fleet. Tufts is enrolled in this program. And so you can see that around year 5 or 6, we're projecting that an electric pickup truck would reach cost parity with the trucks they currently have in their fleet. And then we break down the different cost components there. And what almost always stands out is that there are fuel and maintenance savings from switching to an electric alternative because it's so much simpler. You don't have as many moving pieces. There's less maintenance required. And for the most part, you can structure your EV charging in a way that is going to be a whole lot cheaper than filling your tank with gasoline or diesel. So we're really excited about this, and it's been great to work with so many universities and hospitals and small businesses. We find the small businesses are the ones who benefit most because they don't have dedicated staff to engage on this. So the free consulting paid for by Mass CEC is really helpful. One project outside of Massachusetts here, this name is a mouthful, FEAST, or Freight Electrification as a Service for Transformation. But through this program, we have funding from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority to work with a couple major fleet operators to deploy Class 8 electric trucks as part of their fleet, which is exciting on its own. But then what I get really excited about is the workforce development piece of this. So we're working with the Bronx Community College to develop workforce training programs so that students there can enroll in hands-on training with electric trucks, with the EV charging equipment to prepare themselves for a career in that growing industry. And then we're working with a local nonprofit in the Hunts Point area of the Bronx to help think through how we can maximize the impact for that community and for the stakeholders that they know best. So it's been really great to make the connection between some of the giant corporations we're working with there, all the way down to the community level and figure out how everybody can work together in an effective way. The last project that I'm going to highlight here is the East Coast Commercial ZEV Corridor, another mouthful of a name. This is another Department of Energy funded project. The Department of Energy has made a commitment. They've developed a strategy around zero-emission freight, working to figure out how we're going to electrify all of those semi-trucks that travel up and down 95 and all the major highways across the country. Because those vehicles are such high mileage vehicles, they pollute so much that if we want to deliver major impact, we need to figure out a solution there. And these are vehicles that can't just go back to a depot and charge each time they drive. So this project is all about developing corridor charging locations so that those trucks moving from Boston down to DC or Atlanta know that they'll have reliable charging access along the way. But it's not easy. It's going to require a whole lot of hands working together. So there's a subset of the partners we're working with there, including some of the really major utilities up and down the East Coast, Clean Cities coalitions, community groups, to figure out how we develop criteria for siting those charging locations, and then identifying financing, identifying what the fleets like Amazon and UPS need in terms of charging infrastructure, and building this out in a way that works. And with that, I think we've reached the end of the projects that I wanted to highlight. There's a whole lot more that we can cover there, but I'll pause there. And okay.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I want to ask two questions. One, perhaps a nitpicky question. I noticed that many of the children getting dropped off at my daughter's elementary school are coming by bike in those sort of cargo bikes. And I noticed that in the presentation about the e-bikes for environmental justice, only one of the members of the family was wearing a helmet. And I was thinking, did you guys ever try out some of those crazy urban cradle type bikes to see if this would actually reduce far more drives that a family is taking than just giving one rider a helmet and a bike? And I also wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about going back to school during graduate school while you were working, and whether or not your employer helped to pay for grad school. I'm always talking about that with students, and I'm so excited to see an example. Thank you so much. Great.
Thanks. Okay. Is this working? Can you hear me okay in the back? Good catch on the helmets.
Hello.
Everybody who received one of those bikes went to a training to make sure they could ride them safely. E-bikes are a little bit different. Everybody got a helmet, and that was a strict part of the training. I believe for that project, we did not have any cargo bikes, the kind where you can have a few people sitting on them, but those are awesome. I see so many of those in my neighborhood now, replacing a lot of car trips. If you don't have kids on the back, you can fit a lot of groceries on the back. So it's really cool to see those becoming more commonplace. And I believe that will be a point of emphasis for the statewide program. So excited about that. Was there anything else on the e-bikes? Okay. On the going back to school question, yeah, so I was about 5 or 6 years into my career path when I decided I wanted to go back to school. I was really enjoying my work and learning a lot about it. I felt like I was in just a little bit over my head on a lot of the things I was doing, which seemed like the sweet spot to be for learning. So I didn't want to take 2 years off to go back and get a master's degree. So this program through Duke allowed me to get that master's degree by going to class at night, which frankly, I wasn't all that excited about, but it was worth it. It was a really great cohort of mid-career professionals. Everybody else had more experience than I did and had a lot to share about their career paths, about what they've seen as leaders in the environmental space. And then for me, it was nice to be able to really add to my education with some refined selections there. So I got to do some in-depth analysis on costing out the transition to electric vehicles and things that I'm using every day now. So really, really glad I was able to do that. My employer did not cover the cost of tuition, but made it possible for me to do that in other ways with schedule flexibility. I had to take off a fairly significant amount of time to go down to Durham and participate in some of the coursework there. So that was helpful. If you're in a position where you can do a master's program that is directly advancing your role at your job, you're going to have a better chance of getting it paid for by your employee.
Yeah, thank you so much for this lecture. I was very interested in the fact that so many of your projects were funded by the government, and I was wondering what the process was like for procuring that funding and what your relationship with the government is, and like, did you apply for a grant or how did that work?
Steps today.
Yeah, really good question. The majority of CalSTART's work is government funded, either by state governments or the federal government, sometimes from municipalities. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that works. We do also receive funding from foundations. There are a lot of foundations out there that are focused on advancing sustainability. Many of them have a specific focus on clean transportation. So really grateful for that funding, as it allows us to really hone in on what that mission is. For the government funding, many of those are competitive funding opportunities. So the US DOT or DOE or the Mass Clean Energy Center, they will put out a request for proposals where they're saying, we have this much funding and here's what we want to accomplish. We want somebody to develop this program and implement it. And we will see those RFPs. Sometimes we'll be alerted about them directly because of the work that we've already done. Sometimes we have to find them on our own. And it can be a really time-intensive and competitive process. But that's where a lot of our funding comes from, is from those grants. And actually, one more quick thing I'll add. You know, you had mentioned the upcoming elections. So much of the funding that we get is a result of the bill and IRA, the federal funding that's been rolling out under the Biden administration. That has been totally transformative for this industry, to the extent that progress will continue regardless of what happens this coming November. But we know it'll be a whole lot faster if the funding continues to be funneled to these high impact projects.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. All of like the current projects that you discussed were super interesting, and I had a question about the last one. You talked about having like a charging corridor in New England to be able to like transport commercial vehicles. And you talked about how the industry and like the demands are a lot higher than what the infrastructure currently has. What does the infrastructure currently look like along the Northeast?
The infrastructure for electric trucks or for diesel trucks? For electric trucks, it's pretty limited. There is very little corridor charging for electric trucks on the East Coast right now. There have been a few big deployments recently in California. A lot of what's happening in the electric truck space started in California. Our organization began in California some 30 years ago, hence the name. But we are now seeing more and more funding being deployed to start the installation of those charging stations. Actually, just yesterday, New Jersey made an announcement about a program to deploy $250 million that they won from the federal government. And that'll include charging in New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and Connecticut. And so we're starting to see more and more projects like that coming. Those are really closely connected with this planning work that we're doing. So it's great to see that progress. We're going to need to see a whole lot more of it, but we're getting there. And I will also note that those Class 8 tractor trailers are probably going to be the last segment of the vehicle population to be widely electrified because they're more expensive, because the charging is a little bit more challenging, more expensive. But we're getting there.
I'm actually gonna squeeze in a question, if I may, and it's about timeline. How long does somebody have to work for CALSTART to see a project through from the moment you get the money until the project is implemented?
Yeah, good question. It's a lot easier to deploy an e-bike than it is a charging hub for electric trucks. So it depends on the part of the team that you're on and what projects you're working on. This is a long-term effort. So we kicked off this planning project about this time last year, and we have received funding through New Jersey to start building some of this infrastructure, but that won't be online for another couple of years. So this is a really long-term effort because it requires so much new power to be delivered by the utilities. That can be really time intensive too, because they have to go through extensive permitting. So they don't always have the power capacity through existing transmission lines. So they need to build more of that infrastructure. It can be really challenging to figure out where they're going to build that infrastructure without interfering too much with communities. So this was the last slide because it's the most time intensive and challenging, and these are the biggest projects that we're working on.
That would be super helpful.
Hi, my name is Drew. Just to respond to your question, so I run the South End branch of the e-bike lending library. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we do free loans for people up to a week of cargo bikes, e-bikes, and I have the numbers here. So you asked, like, are they replacing car trips? The answer is yes, of course, absolutely. We've done 559 loans in the past 14 months. 105 of those have resulted in people purchasing them. The vast majority of those are electric cargo bikes, the bigger ones that are carrying 1, 2, even 3 kids. So that's really incredible for us to see. And so, yes, it is kind of a top-down way of getting people into more sustainable transportation from a car to a cargo bike, rather than from walking up to bicycle, anyway. My question for you, Jordan, is what are you doing, if anything, to encourage people to get away from cars, even electric cars, for employers to create secure, safe, covered parking at workspaces?
Yeah, really, really good question. And Drew, I've got a follow-up question for you after this. I'm really envious of the South End residents who have access to those e-bikes now. I used to live there and wish I had access to them. In terms of what we're doing to support more people to shift away from passenger vehicles, whether it's an electric vehicle or a gas vehicle, that's where our innovative mobility initiative is focused. That's really 100% of their objective. So figuring out on a policy perspective, how can we get more state DOTs to include VMT, vehicle miles traveled reduction targets built into their planning, making sure that any investment that they're making in new infrastructure considers that and considers the emissions impact. We're looking into low emission zones, which we're seeing more and more of in big cities around the US. So to make sure that we're not over polluting with new cars coming in there and creating more ways for people to get around in those zones car free. We recently completed a project in the Albany area, a mobility hubs project, where we received funding from the state to build out a network of mobility options around existing bus stations. So adding e-bike shares, adding a couple EV car shares, painting new bike lanes, creating more covered spaces for people to comfortably wait for the bus and make that transition without having to worry about the weather. And we're doing a whole lot more along those lines, developing blueprints for municipalities on how they can advance that. So that's one of the areas that I am most passionate about. It's a small percentage of my time that I get to spend working on it, but I'm really excited.
We actually have former Commissioner Suber on the line with a question. So Brianna.
Yeah, so it says, hi Jordan, great presentation, great projects. I'm glad to see work on the corridor electrification effort. As you are working with so many entities to plan with, are there lessons or surprises that you have learned or encountered that might be good for people who will be leading these types of efforts in the future to know about?
Yeah, so one of the lessons that I've learned, and Commissioner Suberg, I know it's a lesson you've learned too through all of your great work, is how important it is to engage the communities that are going to be impacted, whether positively or negatively, by these types of projects. I remember Commissioner Suberg going way out to Western Mass for a community-focused event just a couple days after the 2016 election. That was a tough time to be on the road thinking about this kind of work, but I appreciate you making the effort to do that. And we're continuing to incorporate that lesson into this kind of major planning project. So all of the Queen Cities that are listed here, the Queen Cities coalitions, their main objective within this project is to work directly with the communities that are along the I-95 corridor, identifying how those communities could benefit from their perspective from the deployment of new infrastructure here, but really making sure that there's not going to be a new substation built in a community that's already really overburdened by that infrastructure. Even though we're focused on reducing pollution from trucks, and that should help the communities that are harmed most by that pollution, there's still a real concern about increased truck traffic. That doesn't matter whether it's a diesel or electric truck. So figuring out how we can work most closely with those communities to ensure these projects are a win for everybody and not just the big major, the corporates and the utilities, is really critical. And doing that as early as possible is necessary.
Can you raise your hand? Clark?
You kind of went over it a little bit already, but also another part of this, within this project, I understand that like a lot of your funding for your projects comes from the federal government. This clearly goes like with a lot of like individual states on the East Coast. I'm curious as to like how you handle with like state government, but also those communities, like the opposition versus the support for these projects, and how you might get funding from each individual state to get their part in a really combined effort.
Yeah, good question. So one thing on the funding here, in many cases, the federal or state funding that we receive for a project has to be accompanied by a match. So some private company or a state that is going to benefit from this needs to pony up some of their own funding to make this happen. So that's one of the ways that the funding is augmented. A lot of the funding for the build out of this corridor, so the US Department of Energy is funding the planning. When it comes to the actual building of infrastructure, buying the chargers, doing the construction work, that's off. A lot of that is coming through funding that is delivered from the federal government to individual states. And then those individual states who know their region best will reallocate that funding to projects in their state. And that's where there's a little bit more opportunity for engagement with community leaders, with municipal governments to make sure everything is coordinated effectively.
Hi. I know there's a lot of discussion around electric vehicles, and if they're actually, I know a lot of people are worried about, are they actually more environmentally friendly than like standard gas vehicles due to mining of the materials for the batteries? And I was just curious on your perspective on that.
Yes, great question again. Um, just because it's electric and doesn't have any emissions coming out of a tailpipe doesn't mean that it's totally clean. And up front, right now, there's a higher GHG impact to manufacture an electric vehicle than there is a gasoline vehicle. What we're seeing is that usually, depending on how much that vehicle is used, by year 2 or 3, you kind of net out on the lifetime GHG costs. And then every year after that, you're seeing greenhouse gas savings. The mining of rare materials for batteries is a really big issue, and it's one that I think by investing more in US manufacturing, where we have stricter regulations, we're seeing improvements, but it also requires international diplomacy and working with other countries that have those reserves to make sure that we're imposing standards as and where we can to feel comfortable with the resources that we're getting there. So it's not a simple question, but an important one. No, good.
Thank you.
So for my question, I believe you mentioned that you're from New York. So my question is related to the congestion pricing. I know that the governor has essentially knocked it down, but I'm interested if, especially considering your role in the Northeast, if you have any insight on if you believe that that will be implemented at some point, if you think congestion pricing can be applied in other cities, and just general implications or other things you'd like to add to that policy.
Yeah. It's been really disheartening to see what happened in New York. A lot of the folks that we work with were really excited about congestion pricing, both because of the price signal that it would deliver to discourage increased traffic in those areas that are really heavily hit by traffic and pollution from vehicles, but also because of the funding that it would bring in to increase investment in public transit and all of the other mode shift activities that we want to see happening. So yeah, really disappointed that Governor Hochul decided to press pause on that. I'm still optimistic that we'll see that in the Northeast, maybe still in New York next, but I wouldn't promise it anytime soon. As we're seeing in New York, it's just really challenging politically. It's been discussed quite a bit in Massachusetts. There was a commission that was charged with looking into it. There have been advocates pushing for it before I was an advocate pushing for it. It's been on the radar for a while, and I hope we'll see it. I think it just makes so much sense, but it's a tricky policy to message to the broader population.
Hi, I'm Rajat. I'm a grad student in sustainability program here. So I want to know, like, does CalSTART projects come also under any kind of reporting regulations, like, or if not, like, do you guys follow any kind of reporting regulations in context of like GRI or SEC or IRIS Plus or anything? Because what I understand, the overall the funds which CalSTART is receiving is coming under the ambit of sustainable finance. So yeah.
Yeah, so the reporting requirements are entirely dependent on what the funder imposes on us. So if it's a foundation that is giving us a grant to do some work on something like congestion pricing, the reporting requirements are generally minimal. We tell them what we did with the money, and hope they're happy with the work that we've performed for them. When it's a government entity that is giving us the funding, there are more intense reporting requirements, more so with the federal agencies than with the state agencies. So in some cases, those can be very time intensive and require a lot of data logging, which is a big part of the project. In other cases, not so much. So it varies.
Okay, we have 3 more questions in the chat. The first one is, most mechanics can't or won't work on electric vehicles, forcing customers to only utilize first-party or dealer maintenance, which is usually more expensive. What's being done to upskill non-dealer maintenance workers to be able to support the growing percentage of EVs as their customer base moves away from ICE?
Yeah, that's a really big challenge through this transition right now. And there is a lot of investment happening right now to create more and more of those mechanic training programs. Yeah, it's not a huge shift to go from being a mechanic working on an internal combustion engine vehicle to an electric vehicle, but there are challenges, there are differences, there are new safety hazards that you need to be aware of. And so the training is critical. I mentioned the FEAST project that we're working on in the Bronx. That is state funded. So we are getting funding from the state to support those workforce training programs through the Bronx Community College. Massachusetts Clean Energy Center has invested a really significant amount of funding in workforce training for a variety of clean energy roles. So from solar and wind technicians to EV and EV charging techs. We're going to be working with some of the folks that have gone through that program on an upcoming project. So it's exciting to see all of that training and investment in that training bearing fruit and having new skilled workforce who can support the deployment of these types of projects. That's not the case in every state. So we want to see more and more investment going into those training programs because the last thing we want to see are companies buying electric trucks, getting the charging installed, and then realizing when they have their first issue with that vehicle or that charger that they can't find support to deal with it. So we want to make sure that that workforce is growing along with the number of vehicles that are being deployed.
Thank you. This next question is from Colin Oriens, the head of ENVS here. So he says, thank you so much for sharing all these programs. I am struck by the Pennsylvania data. Why is this? Having just traveled on I-70, I have noticed that the number of trucks has always blown me away. What can we learn from Pennsylvania?
Thanks, Colin. I assume this is the slide that you were referring to. Pennsylvania really stands out because it has a much lower percentage of its total CO2 emissions coming from transportation than the rest of the states in the region. It's not because Pennsylvania has really clean vehicles. It's because so much of the emissions from Pennsylvania are coming from the power sector. There are a lot of power plants in Pennsylvania. Those power plants are becoming cleaner. They're implementing new policies to support renewable development, but it's still a major source of economic activity in the state, and they generate a lot of electricity that is then exported into New York and New England and the Mid-Atlantic.
All right, last one. This one says, Colin says, thanks for the clarification. And the question is, what are your most and least favorite parts working for a nonprofit versus a company in the private sector?
I really like that at the nonprofit I work at now, the nonprofits I worked at previously, everybody is rowing in the same direction. Whatever their role within the company, whether they're deploying EV charging or on the finance team or working on contracts, everybody is gravitated towards this company because they believe in the mission and they want to do what they can to support that change. And so it just helps to ground you even when things are frustrating and you're working on a boring task that's part of a bigger project, to have that solidarity with your coworkers, that you all want to achieve that same thing, that really helps. The private sector can be really exciting too. I feel like I've found the best of both worlds for me at CalSTART because we're getting projects built and working directly with our private sector partners to do that. But I think that piece is really, really valuable, and it's helpful to complement experience in the advocacy nonprofit world, where you are really focused on research and telling people how to do their jobs, with some experience gained from actually trying to build infrastructure and confronting regulations and evaluating what it takes to get good things done. It becomes a little bit more complicated when you kind of peek behind the curtains and see everything that needs to happen to get that moving.
We're going to leave it here. Thank you so much, Jordan. This was so informative. Let's thank him one more time.